New Thought Media Network is proud to present New Thought's Roots and Branches with Reverend Dr. Ruth Miller. Join us every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Mountain Time. Tune in live or watch anytime on our YouTube channel. Discover the rich history of New Thought and its impact on modern spirituality. Join Reverend Dr. Ruth Miller as she shares insights, stories, and teachings that inspire and uplift. Experience deep insights and transformative teachings that connect you to the roots of New Thought. Visit our YouTube channel to catch up on past episodes and join us live every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Connect with us and be part of the journey.
Hi there. I am Ruth Miller, and this is New Thought Roots and Branches. And today, after we've gone through this long process of looking at the early antecedents, etc., we're going to talk about someone who isn't even on the map. We're going to talk today about Wallace D. Wattles. And Wallace Wattles is actually a little earlier than the generation we've been talking about, but his work has strongly affected the last 100 years and more of many people, but particularly the last 30 years, because Wallace Wattles' work was the basis for Rhonda Byrne's movie, The Secret. So let's learn about this fellow. In the next chart, you'll see that he's not even on the map, really. I kind of stuck him in off it to the edge because he is working in a way, you can see his little rectangle down there in the corner. He is working with the same level of people that we are talking about these days, the Louise Hayes and Wayne Dyers and all those folks who are affecting our world today very much. And most people have no idea that he's part of the New Thought movement. Isn't that fun? If we go into the next map, you'll see he's not even on there. There is no picture, no name, no nothing that suggests that Wallace Wattles is part of New Thought. Now, the reason for that is Wallace's work has always been associated with and greatly used by the masculine arm of New Thought, the business world, the world of people out there making change and earning money for their families, rather than focusing on relationships and health, which are often called the feminine arm of the New Thought tradition. So Wallace Wattles' work has affected lots and lots of people. And I was introduced to it because the folks who published The Secret wanted that book that he wrote back in 1910 to make sense to modern audiences. So it was the first of the series that I did in the Library of Hidden Knowledge. We called it The New Science of Getting Rich. And I have to tell you, Amazon had a terrible time. They were always confusing reviews of Wattles' book with reviews of my book. And it was kind of funny to watch for about 10 years. But we're pretty much worked it out now. The New Science of Getting Rich is my version of Wallace's language with the exercises and the summary points, and then his language in the back. The book, The Science of Getting Rich, I never liked that title. And I will explain later why I was willing to accept that, because it turns out he really is New Thought. Let's take a look at this guy. This is Wallace in his last couple of years. And he was someone who kind of would remind you a little bit of Abraham Lincoln, which is not too surprising. If we look in the next slide, we'll see that he was born in 1860 in Northern Illinois. And in fact, I had to laugh when I saw this because I used to drive past where he was born a lot because I lived in Chicago and my grandmother lived in Rockford, and he was right on the road, one of the northern curved roads between Chicago and Rockford in Illinois. That was kind of cool. So he grew up in farm country, and most of those towns had a one-room schoolhouse. My cousins went to some of those kind of schoolhouses. And so he made it through 8th grade in that one-room schoolhouse. Now we have to remember, though, 8th grade in 1860 or 1870 or even 1880 was nothing like 8th grade in the 1950s through 2020s. He grew up reciting Shakespeare sonnets and parts of the plays. He grew up experimenting with geometry, experimenting with trigonometry, experimenting with all kinds of things, getting a smattering of Greek and Latin in his 1st through 8th grade. He grew up memorizing the capitals of all the countries of the time, etc. So it's a whole different understanding of education. And he knew a lot more than we usually do at the end of 8th grade. After he completed school, and probably while he was completing school, because he was living in farm country, he worked as a farmhand. And his father, being a gardener, didn't have a whole lot of money, so there wasn't anything there to make it possible for Wallace to go on into higher education. But I'm thinking that his father understood what it meant to be wealthy, even when the money wasn't there, because it looks to me as if Wallace has been operating on that framework most of his life. He married a woman named Abby Brand in 1887, and they had 3 kids, and those kids wrote about Wallace later, saying he absolutely lived everything he ever wrote or taught. They moved, when they married, to Elwood, Indiana, which is almost a straight line from where he was born, through Chicago down to Elwood, Indiana. And he made quite a name for himself in that place. The next slide will tell us he became first a Methodist preacher. Now, it was possible in the 1880s, 90s to do that. And you may recall, some of you know this already, that my grandmother's father, who was about the same age as Wallace, was a Methodist lay preacher, wandering around, going around on Sundays from church to church. And then during the week, he was a geology professor. So that was an interesting experience. Well, Wallace wasn't a professor by any means. Wallace was a hardworking man. And as a Methodist lay minister, he was very effective, but then he got kicked out as a heretic. And the reason is because in 1896, he became involved in a movement called Practical Christianity. Now, those of you who remember listening to Charles and Myrtle, they created the School of Practical Christianity. So they were aware of this movement at a time when most of us are not even thinking it could possibly have existed. And also, part of that movement and some of the people that Wallace was involved in were beginning to understand what became known in the 1950s as the social gospel of Jesus, that it wasn't just about the crucifixion and resurrection. It was about what he was teaching us about how to live together in a loving way. And also about how the early church was very much communal. All right, which is to say, if you read the book of Acts, you'll see they brought everything they owned together. They shared it equally. They served in the community from what they already had. They brought back in more gifts and they shared it as communes. And yes, the 1960s hippies, many of them were intentionally trying to recreate the early Christian church. So what Wallace saw was that Jesus was teaching what we would call today socialism. And he called it socialism. He called Jesus the great socialist and taught Christian socialism, for which the Methodists said, that's heresy, please leave. All right. And during this time, he wrote 2 books. One is called A New Christ, and the other is called Jesus, Man and His Work. So he's coming at it from the social cultural perspective rather than from the worship the divine perspective. This was a very, very unusual stance to take, but he was surrounding himself with people who were comfortable with that at that point of the turn of the 1800s to the 1900s. And while he was in Indiana, after he began to be more successful, he ended up running for office on the Socialist Party ticket and was a major, major contributor to the Theodore Roosevelt campaign under the Progressive Party ticket. Fascinating how involved someone could have been 230 years ago in things that we think are only very common today, yes? As we look at the next slide, we see that that opening in 1896 also opened him to Emma Curtis Hopkins. And he would commute to Chicago and study with her. He also studied with some other names that we'll see later on this slide that were very well known in later years, let me say that. And then he would go home to Elwood and do his Sunday night lecture series. And he called his lectures a monistic theory of the cosmos. And if any of you have read Amit Goswami, he is calling his theory monistic idealism, which is very Plato, very much in alignment with Plato. But Wattles would tell people they needed to read Hegel and they needed to read Ralph Waldo Emerson to understand this material. So as he was getting all of these ideas in place, he began writing short articles for a woman whose journal, called Nautilus, was originally set up in South Dakota, but then she ended up moving it to Holyoke, Massachusetts, and creating her own publishing company, Elizabethtown Publishing. And it was Elizabethtown who made Wallace's work available to people outside of Chicago and Elwood, Indiana. So we owe a lot to Elizabethtown and her New Thought magazine. It was explicitly New Thought, running from about 1898 to 1953. Wow. She was one of the ways all of these ideas were carried through during that long period. And she would take the articles and she would turn them into books. And that's how she made it happen in a reasonably effective way. And in the next slide, you get to see some of Wallace's books. The Science of Getting Rich is the one everyone knows. And as I said, that was the basis for Rhonda Byrne's experience. It was the old copy of something that her daughter gave her in the intro to the movie The Secret. But he went on and he wrote other books. So if you look in the upper portion of this slide, you'll see the reddish title, How to Be a Genius or The Science of Being Great. Well, modern marketers left out the first part, the How to Be a Genius, and focused on the science of being great. They set up this process of encouraging a similarity. And then he wrote another book, Health Through New Thought and Fasting, which was later published as The Science of Being Well. And that book about Jesus, the new Christ, was also called A New Jesus down there in the corner. And you can there are many, many compilations out there because there is no Wallace Wattles estate holding the copyright to any of this. This is all public domain, which is why I could do this New Science of Getting Rich. There's no copyright on it. So you can find versions of his works put out by almost 100 different companies now, and just find the one that feels right to you if you decide to follow up on Wallace Wattles' work. So what was his approach? In the next slide, we are looking at a man who is saying this is a practical process and he's tested everything before he's written about it. He said he tested his methods on himself and others before he would publish them. He encouraged his readers to test his theories on themselves rather than take his word as an authority. And if you go through any of those books we just looked at, you will see him saying this over and over again. He has very clear principles, very clear ideas of what needs to be done and how it should be done. But he is saying, don't take my word for it. Try it yourself. Now, that's interesting. He seems to have been a bit of a punster. We'll talk about that in a second again. But don't take my word on it. Try it for yourself means he's getting his reader to experiment with it and try it. And he knows, because it is a certain science, that it will work, right? So one of the things that he did was what we call today creative visualization, and that was to form the mental picture or visual image and then work toward the realization, okay? His articles, he wrote almost constantly, right, during this time. This is his daughter talking about him after he passed on. It was then that he formed his mental picture, okay? He would write to help form his mental picture. then he'd see himself as a successful writer, a personality of power, an advancing man, and he began to work toward the realization of this vision. He lived every page. His life was truly the powerful life. So here's this little man who, the only pictures we have show him as being quite frail, quite almost scrawny, right? But he is a very powerful presence, because in his understanding and his experience and his experiments, he found that what he focused on continually became his experience, which, frankly, is what New Thought is about, isn't it? So let's look at the foundation of his thinking in the next slide. This is actually why I was willing to do the work on a book whose title I did not like. I didn't think we should be getting rich. I didn't think that was what we should be doing. But he says in the opening pages of that book that the universe is designed to support the full development, that the nature of the universe is such that the full development of every being is fully supported from the initial idea through its full and complete expression. So here, this is a quote from him: "The purpose of life for man, for any person, for any being, is growth, just as the purpose of life for trees and plants is growth. Trees and plants grow automatically and along fixed lines. Man can grow as he will. Trees and plants can only develop certain possibilities and characteristics. Man, again, all humans, can develop any power which is or has been shown by any person anywhere. If it's ever been experienced or expressed, any human being can have it, do it, and be it." This was absolutely fundamental, these two sides of it. One, that we're all being supported in becoming most fully who we are, and two, that who we are fully includes everything, every capacity that any human being has ever had. And then he says the very best thing you can do for the world is to make the most of yourself, right? If we all have all this power and capacity, can you imagine what the world would be like if we were all living at that level of creative generativity, at that level of understanding, at that level of wisdom, realizing that the one whole beingness, the monist, that oneness, mona meaning one, right? Mono, that one beingness is expressing fully in every aspect, every being in it. The world would be fabulous, yes? So that's the direction he's working in. In the next slide, we get to see what he calls a certain way, okay? He says getting rich isn't about doing certain things. It's about doing things in the certain way. So this is that pun again. It is certain. The results are certain, but it's also specific, right? It's both understandings of the word certain. I'm sure he chuckled when he realized that, right? So it isn't that we have to do this, 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 and this. It's that whatever we are doing in a specific way. And when we do that, the results are certain. So some of those things that make up the certain way: the more gratefully we fix our minds on the Supreme, when good things come to us, the more good things we will receive. So gratitude, and modern research is totally supporting this. Anyone who's following Joe Dispenza is aware of how he's been teaching and preaching gratitude as part of how we can be who we really are and experience, among other things, immunity. Isn't that interesting? So the more gratefully we fix our minds on the Supreme, on the infinite source through which and by which and as which we experience the good things that are present here, right? Then, he says, begin to do small things in a great way. You must put the whole power of your great soul into every act. And in the book, Science of Getting Rich, and also the Science of Becoming Great, both of those are saying, you may be sweeping floors today. Do it in a great way. Do it bringing all of your soul into it. Bring every aspect of who you really are to whatever the smallest task is. And very soon, the small task becomes a very important task, but you've mastered all the small tasks to get you there. I'm reminded of the apprentices that would work with the great masters during the Renaissance, right? They'd have these huge paintings, whole walls sometimes, right? And the master would sketch it out. And then he would assign this little corner to this apprentice. And he would show the apprentice, now you hold the brush this way. You dip it in the paint this way. You hold your hand this way. And then you move it just like that. Very, very tiny, tiny movements. But then the master who was actually developing his apprentices would then say, yes, that's excellent. Now bring your soul into the next line. Yes, that's it. Right. So he's building the interior life of the apprentice while he's developing these tiny, tiny little skills that will then show up in great mastery in some number of years, usually, unfortunately, 10 to 20 years, but sometimes almost automatically as they got into harmony and sync because the apprentice was doing these things this way. So the very last point he says, give everyone more in use value than you take from him in cash value. Then you are adding to the life of the world by every business transaction. Now that is running counter to what most of the corporate capitalist greed system teaches. It's saying charge as much as you can and offer as little as possible. That is not how people get rich. It is not how people become wealthy from the inside out. Yes. Every time we give more than is asked for or is paid for, everyone wins. We move from win-lose scenarios to win-win scenarios, and the development of all beings is encouraged. In the next slide, we get to see some of the concepts that he's using, and some of you who have studied Emma Hopkins or Charles Fillmore will hear some very familiar lines here, because guess what? They had the same teacher. They were the same teacher. I mean, Emma taught both of them. And so there's a lot of overlap. So success is becoming what you want to be. Actually, Ralph Waldo Emerson said this, to be an excellent parent, to have built a garden, to have healthy grandchildren, and he goes on, contributed to your community is to be successful. Absolutely. Success is becoming what you want to be and is attained by applying your energies, that inner soul presence, to your work. And you will apply your energies in exact proportion to the intensity of your desire. If you don't really want it, you're not really going to put the effort into it. And anyone who's tried to teach high schoolers is aware of this, or middle schoolers. But, raising kids, you see this. But let's look at our own lives. How many times have we gone through the motions thinking that was how we were going to get something done, instead of bringing forth what it is that we're here to bring forth? One of my favorite stories in this whole realm of the masculine New Thought world is the story of the two guys that were pounding spikes into railroad ties when they were in their late teens and early 20s. And 20 years later, one of them is continuing to pound spikes into railroad ties. And the man who comes to visit him is now the president of the railroad. And the guy who's still doing the same job says, what happened? What was your lucky break? And the man who became the president of the railroad says, you are putting railroad ties into the ground. You are pounding spikes. I was building a railroad. That's the difference. If I'm sweeping a floor, it's not that I'm moving dust around. It's that I'm creating the space for people to enjoy and grow and develop in. Yes? And that can apply to any job out there. Then he goes on in the second point. It's impossible for an anxious person, a worried one, or a fearful one to perceive truth. And I would have capitalized that T. All things are distorted and thrown out of their proper relations by such mental states. And again, we all know this. When we're depressed or not feeling really well, we see the world as not okay. But as we go, you know what it's like when you're in love, everything is wonderful, right? Everybody loves a lover. Oh, no. I didn't mean to do that. Yes, I did. All right. So yeah, when we're in the dumps, the world looks yucky. When you're alone, you know that song, I won't go there. The next point is the more gratefully we fix our mind on the Supreme. There we are again, that same concept. That's fundamental. Our gratitude is fundamental to our well-being. In the next slide, he talks about the power of thought in all of this. Thought is the only power which can produce tangible riches from the formless substance, or tangible anything. Thought is the power that brings form or matter out of the quantum substance of all that is. Where there is no observer, there is no matter. There is only infinite pools and waves of energy. Observer present, bingo, we got particles. No observer, we got waves. It's been proven over and over again. So thought is the only power which can produce tangible riches or anything else, a tangible home, a tangible person in our life, a tangible pet coming to us, whatever it is. And if we are getting tangible things, guess what? It's been in our thought. And then he goes on. By thought, the thing you want is brought to you. Now, what you want is what you are focusing on. So if you're focusing on something you would rather not be experiencing, guess what? Your thought is bringing it to you anyway. And by action, you receive it. So as you act in alignment with your thinking, if it's in the direction of more good, you get more good. That gratitude piece helps you get more good, right? You're thinking about how wonderful it is to have this experience, so you get more of it. All right. Then he goes on to say, you cannot retain a true and clear vision of wealth or well-being in any form if you are constantly turning your attention to opposing pictures, whether they be external or imaginary. And other places he tells us, don't let those other ideas enter into your awareness. But if I'm constantly thinking of how distressed I have been, or how I don't have what I want, or any of those nasty things that I used to think a lot, I kept myself in distress and not enough. Now I know better, and it's amazing. There's always more than enough. And in situations where things didn't seem possible, they're happening. I feel so blessed, and I'm so grateful. And then the other point at the bottom of that page, while you rest, do not think of your present weakness. Think of the strength that is coming. Okay, so we're going around, we're being really, really active. We're meeting a lot of people. We're getting a lot done. Whatever it is, maybe we've chopped wood for several hours. Maybe we've gone for a wonderful hike. And the body is going, can I rest, please? All right. But we don't think about how tired we are. We think about how wonderful we are becoming, how beautifully healthy we are experiencing ourselves. We think about the well-being rather than thinking about any form of distress or weakness. And that brings us into that whole thing of outside influences in the next slide. Everything that touches your life is an opportunity if you discover its proper use, okay? Everything that touches our life, whether it looks good or not, it is an opportunity for us to discover what moves us into our greater development because of this experience. So we've often been taught to seek the good in what appears to be bad. Perhaps a more effective way to do it is to see the opportunity in every situation, every person, every item, every object that comes our way. I know a number of very creative people who, when some object comes their way, I'm going to use this cell phone as an example. This is a foldable cell phone. It showed up in a shop that I happen to be part owner of. And most people are going, why do you want that? Right? But I am finding it to be absolutely ideal for the situation I'm in as I'm traveling all the time. All right. Now, some creative person would figure out some unique thing they could do with it that I haven't figured out. But I know people like that, and they would. Some people will pick up a piece of pipe and see it immediately as what it could be in some situation that they're looking for. So everything that touches our life is an opportunity. And the same thing in that second point, you can't retain a true idea if you're turning to the opposite pictures. The third point, read only the most optimistic comments on the world's news, those in harmony with your picture. Now, I have on my website a sharings page, and I write about various things, and I put videos and stuff up there. And the website is that thing that's at the bottom of most of these slides. And in it, I have a link to something called the Good News Network. Not because I particularly want to support them, but because it gives people an opportunity to see something other than what the public networks and the cable networks and those other places and all too many internet sites want us to be focusing on. There is so much good happening in this world. And if you haven't seen a website called theculturalbutterfly.com, Elaine Cornick, the webmaster there, is collecting just beautiful, beautiful examples of all the good that is happening in this world, all the ways land and water are being regenerated and restored, all the ways that people are coming together in community, all the new technologies that are emerging that are allowing us to consider the possibility, and for me to be absolutely committed to the expectation that heaven and earth are coming together. Are you willing to be that far along in your choosing of what to observe? If so, hit pause and restart and replay those parts. Yes. The fourth point on the bottom of this one is you are not mentally developed by what you read, and that include what you're watching on the screen, but by what you think about what you read. I'm working with a young man who's just beginning to come into the New Thought world right now. We found a marvelous little book that has little one-page things, and so I have him read them to me every day. And then I have him tell me, all right, what do you think about that? How does that feel? Does that work for you? What's wrong with that idea? Or what's right with that idea? And the difference in how he comes back in the next few days is palpable. And when I'm teaching a class, I rarely have an exam that says, what did so-and-so say on page whatever about such and such? It will almost always be, and how does this idea affect your life? Yes, that's the kind of thinking that Wallace Wattles is encouraging us to do whenever we're working with any ideas at all in the world around us and in our own awareness. Now, during his lifetime, he began to be a very powerful person, as his daughter indicated, and he began to get called to speak and attend meetings all over mostly the Midwest because, travel took a while then. So train rides, horse rides, stagecoach rides around to various states around there. Made it to the East Coast a couple of times, but basically he was a Midwest guy. Yep. Well, as he did this work, people began to see opportunities and possibilities in themselves, and his own community of Elwood, Indiana, began to see him as a major contributor to the community because he would not only teach these things, he would live these things, and he would help other people live them as well. So when he would go out traveling, sometimes he would take one of his kids with him. Sometimes he would take it and go himself. his kids were all born about by 1894. So in the, turn of the century, they're old enough to travel with him. And then on one of his trips, he was in Tennessee, and he began to have some issues. The piece that is not evident, unless you noticed in the title, Health Through New Thought and Fasting, and unless you really looked at his pictures, is that Wallace believed that there was a mysterious power that was actually healing our bodies when we were asleep, the life force, and that we didn't really need to eat or drink. Now, there are many breatharians in the world, and if you read the autobiography of a yogi, Yogananda met with Teresa in Germany, who was one of the people who was living on the Christ communion in her Catholic Church, her Roman Church in Germany. But she is just one of many who found that they did not need to take in food. For whatever reason, as Wallace was doing his fasting, it wasn't that he felt nourished anyway. And I don't know the issue, but he was committed to the idea that learning to live without food or water would make it possible for us to become immortal. Charles Fillmore also bought into the immortalists, which tells me that the circle around Emma Curtis Hopkins was buying into that. But Charles did not change how he ate. He was a vegetarian, a vegan actually, but he did not try to go without food at all. So it turns out that between 1907 and 1910, Wallace's body became more and more frail. It's possible that there was a tumor eating everything. I doubt it, because he practiced New Thought. But I'm guessing that this habit of fasting was too far along for whatever his current body situation was. And in 1911, he was on a trip to Tennessee. He was working, he was functioning perfectly, just increasingly frail. And he died in his room in Tennessee. His body was put on a train and carried back to his space in Elwood. And when his body returned, all the businesses in town shut down to honor Wallace D. Wattles, this man who had embodied everything that he understood and could help anyone else embody in the way of health and well-being and wealth for this town. And they continued to practice what he was teaching. Elizabethtown, his publisher, continued to publish the books based on his articles. And from 1910 to 1970, there were not a whole lot of editions of it being published, but there were constantly The Science of Getting Rich and The Science of Being Great. And Nightingale Conant, a Chicago publishing company, picked up on them and made them part of their standard materials. And all kinds of people were using this approach to building a business, to building a life, to caring for a family as their normal way of approaching living in the world. The Science of Getting Rich. And as I said early in the program, when Rhonda Byrne was really struggling in Australia, her daughter gave her a photocopy of a typewritten version of The Science of Getting Rich, and it was the turning point and the movement and all the follow-on things to The Secret. A powerful, powerful being. As I say, thousands of copies, hundreds of versions are still out there. If you haven't taken a look, some version of The Science of Getting Rich. The Science of Being Great is the same principles, and it's applied to becoming fully who we can be. Not great by comparison to others, but great as our full. The Science of Being Healthy, well, that includes the fasting, but many of us are now discovering that a certain amount of fasting can be very good for the body. And so if we don't get carried away to the point where we are weak and frail, perhaps we might want to include some of Wattles' ideas there too. A whole new branch of the New Thought movement based on making things happen in the world, bringing things forth. There's a book called The Master Key System by a guy named Charles Haanel, which is a similar kind of thing. There's so much stuff that was built on Wallace Wattles' teachings between 1910 and 2000 when Rhonda Byrne discovered him. And The Secret came out then in 2006. And the rest is history, yes? It's a certain science. You think in a certain way, that is, as it is real now to you, you feel it, and you act in alignment with the completed situation, the completed desire, the completed fulfillment, the completed development of who we are. If what you are truly longing for is the power to accomplish, or the power to heal, or the resources to make a huge difference in the world, if that is your heart's desire, please allow your thoughts to focus on how that feels. Make spreadsheets if that works for you. Draw pictures if that works for you. Write incessantly, as Wattles did. Yes? Until it feels so real, you can almost not imagine it not being there. I had a Unity minister once who was living in Chicago, and she needed some warm coat. She needed a warm coat. The weather there is quite phenomenal in the winter. I used to stand safety patrol at -4 degrees. Yeah. So she needed a warm coat, and she saw one in a window, and she knew it was exactly the right one. And it had quite the price tag on it, which she accepted that somehow was going to show up. And she wrote a check for that amount to that store and pinned it on a wall with a picture of that coat above her desk. And by the time winter came along, she was able to take that check into that store and walk out wearing that coat. She said many times in the interim, she would go to her closet and be surprised it wasn't there. That's the attitude we want to be holding. That is the certain way to have whatever we are feeling called to be become our experience. For so it truly is. And so I want to say thank you for joining me one more time here on New Thought, Roots and Branches as we wander through this world of ideas and practices and experiences and get clearer and clearer about how we are constantly creating the life that we live. Have a marvelous week.